Hello, class. So, the units we begin today um, goes by a few different terms, especially in when considering Polish literature. So sometimes it's called the interwar era, the period between the 20 years between World War I and World War II. Um, Sometimes we refer to it as independent Poland. Um, or the Second Republic. So the First Republic was the ancient, golden age of Poland, and when Poland regains its independence, it's called the Second Republic. Um, so you'll hear me probably use a few different terms. So I'm going to share a whiteboard here. Um, so let's just start off. Interwar Poland. So at the end of World War One, Poland regained its independence after almost 200 years. Short-lived independence. Um, it is not a secure nation state. It has a lot of problems. It's a nation that's trying to be unified, and yet it's working on three different systems. There's a in the east you have a very unindustrialized Russian, once Russian held area, very backwards compared to the rest of the country. In the west, you have Germanic systems. It's a bit more organized, but it's very densely populated by ethnic Germans. In the south, you have kind of frozen in time parts of the Austrian Empire, like Krakow is still a medieval city, basically. Nothing much had been done to Krakow once the Habsburgs had taken over. So it's a bit of a mess. And I have there are a couple of really good explanatory videos on our Sakai site that talks about the troubles that Poland went through during this time. So something important to keep in mind is that only about 70% of the population is, in quotation marks, because whatever this means, ethnically Polish. There are large um, minorities of Ukrainians, Jews, Germans, Belarusians. There's even like a sizable population of Scots, Scottish entrepreneurs, I guess, who had come to settle in Poland while doing business. Um, so this becomes really important to keep in mind when we get into the next era, which is World War II and the Holocaust. So speaking of historical eras, something I like to make clear to students when we get to this period is I'm not going to be speaking about literary or artistic eras anymore. Um, the first part of this class, we talked, we it has been done in terms of artistic programs, literary programs, philosophies, right? Positivists. Well, starting with romantics, and then positivists, and then the young Poland, modernist movements. Um, but that it's difficult to do that kind of thing after World War One. And this is true of a lot of literary traditions. If I was an English major. Uh, I studied English literature, and after World War One, it's really there really is never again a large you know pan national, so like one uh, linguistic tradition, like say like the Anglophone or Francophone or whatever. They don't really have the overarching connecting philosophical or artistic programs anymore. Like there was a moment in Polish literature where the positivists really held sway, and all the Polish, almost all the Polish literature kind of fit into that program. And before that, the Romantics, and then after the positivists, you had the what can it's almost monolithic sometimes, right? There's these eras where we call it young Poland. In English literature, we have like what we call Victorian literature, and there's this. It seems like every author you study at the time fits into this certain category, to a larger or lesser degree. After World War I, this really is never seen again, really. I mean, you do have schools of artistic thought or philosophical thought, but there are many of them, kind of sometimes in competition with each other. And so there's never really, again, a unified, kind of literary or artistic movement that you can speak of, like you could with like the Romantic movement or the Positivists. So I like to, at this point, I like to make clear that now I'm going to be talking about historical moments and not artistic moments, not philosophical moments, right? There are philosophies and artistic programs happening within these periods, but they're really more, you have to speak of them more as historical moments instead. So I just want to make that clear. You stop getting real, uh, literary programs that kind of have this real control over the aesthetic um, of the time, right? They're it's almost difficult to speak of any unified schools. They're all kind artists and authors are basically doing their own things. You can see a lot of similarities between authors and artists, but really it becomes it really just kind of goes all over the place. It's very disparate after World War One. A lot of people try to categorize literature and art of this time as modernist. I guess you could do that, but modernism is really marked by not adhering to any certain aesthetic, and then postmodernist with World War II. But again, that's just an easy category because postmodern, the hallmark of postmodernism is not adhering to a certain philosophical thought or aesthetic. So anyway, so the first author we look at is Witold Gombrowicz. He lived 1904 to 1969. Before he died very very early, kind of suddenly. I think it was he caught pneumonia or something, and just unexpectedly ended up dying. Um, he was basically on the short list for the Nobel Prize in Literature, but they don't do posthumous Nobel prizes, so he didn't win. He's a curious character. He left Poland for Buenos Aires just before the outbreak of World War II, and then he never returned to Poland, and he ended up dying in France. He spent a lot of his life actually in Buenos Aires working odd jobs, working for a Polish bank in Buenos Aires. Um, and he is the consummate anti-patriot. He does not his struggle literarily and I guess in life is he's always working against what he called forms, right, with a capital F. He hated the idea of attempting to put structure around a person. That structure is death, right? He sees life, identity is very important. I'll talk about this in a second. Everything is as fluid. So to attempt to put a structure around that fluidity is to kill it. And so he's constantly, if you read like his nonfiction prose, his journals and his philosophical works, he's always talking about the forms, about form being antithetical to life, right? So identity and its formation are very important themes to a lot of its work, and especially in the work we read uh, in this unit. Um, he struggles with how identity is created. That's an important uh, endeavor for him to find, to play with how identity comes to be created in an individual. Um, he opposes the idea of a unified identity, the idea that we are somehow one. For Gombrowicz, we are not singular, right? An individual is not just one. An individual is multiple. There are several identities within a person, by contesting with each other all the time. Um, he, especially in the story we read from him, we read in this unit, hybrid identity, hybrid hybrid identity is very important to him. Um, and indeed, it is the only true identity in the end, that we are all a hybrid of different identities. If you reading the short story for today, Stefan Czarniecki, um, he calls himself mottled, right? Page 21. He sees himself as, he's comparing, he's not comparing himself to a rat, but he's using the the kind of laboratory rat as a metaphor for the human, right? He's trying to figure out, um, the character is struggling with his, the identity that his Polish father wants him to inhabit, and the identity of his once Jewish uh, mother who converted, who's still, ethnically, I guess you could say, a Jew. So what is created in that pairing then? Is it a patchy individual with like pieces of identity, different identities popping up all over them, or is it just a pure blend, right? Um, and this is the struggle of the main character then. So an interesting thing from the story, as you read it, you may struggle with the language a little bit, the wording, and what he's doing is a lot of his work. Um, well, again, struggle is just the perfect word to use. It struggles against traditional Polish forms and values, right? Traditional values of Poland. Um, but he also uses those forms in order to subvert them. So, what do I mean by that? Well, he uses the genre of the gawenda. So this is the one truly Polish literary genre, like, natively Polish literary genre. Fiction is a native to, was imported. Poetry comes from the Greeks, epic. Um, the novel is created somewhere else and then, brought into Poland. All, the ballad, the sonnet, so there are no natively created genres of Polish literature except for the gawenda, and the gawenda is an old Polish story form. Um, it's um, it, it comes about in the 16th century. So around this time, well, before this time, the Polish nobility was very proud of with how cosmopolitan they were. They were very, they took a lot of pride in the fact that they sent their sons and daughters, well, sons mostly, off to different countries to for study. Especially Italy. They would brag about, the fact that their son got a university education in Italy, studying with the great Enlightenment thinkers and whatnot. Or I guess this is pre-Enlightenment. Um, um, but around the 16th century, this all the nobility of Poland really began to step away from the world. There have been a few different invasions. They become more conservative. They begin to trust. They begin to become suspicious of outsiders, and so the nobility kind of retreat to their manor houses out in like the Lithuanian countryside. And they need entertainment, and so what they begin doing is they go to different, to their neighbors in the area, and something that comes out of this is the Gavenda storytelling style, which is this. It's very much it's tell it, you the goal is to tell your story for as long as possible to entertain the people in front of you, and so what becomes very important is digression and formality. So you get a lot of like, um, you know, random Latin phrases thrown in for no reason, really, but it kind of shows you as an intellectual, right? And digression is very important to this. You're it's very much an oral kind of tradition. It comes out of an oral tradition where you're telling the story of of a battle you're involved in, but you can't just you can't just talk about the battle. You start talking about the horse you're riding into battle on, and then well, where'd the horse come from? So you have to go back, like, digress to a different story, and then eventually the goal is to wind your way back into the original story. But it just keeps coming back like that. And so Gombrowicz, to undermine traditional Polish form, uses the traditional Polish form in order to do that. And you see this in a lot of his works. Transatlantic, the reading we had from the beginning of the semester, is very much done in this Gavenda style. And what is also very, you know, the other kind of funny thing he does with the story is he calls it the Memoirs of Stefan Czarniecki, and the character of the story is, you know, from like he's telling it in kind of an early 20th, maybe late 19th century um, uh, setting, right? He gives it that setting of that time period. But Stefan Czarniecki was an actual person, a rather famous Polish nobleman. Like everyone coming up to this story as a Pole would know who Stefan Czarniecki is, right? And if you see this title, The Memoirs of Stefan Czarniecki, you think, oh, it's going to be this story about this, 16th century Polish nobleman. And then you start reading it and you realize, no, this takes place much later. And so he's using this famous, you know, uh, older personage to undermine the values of that society, of that old Polish nobility, right? And that's the entire point of the story, is to undermine, these old ideas about what it means to be Poland. So that's those are all very important themes to this story. Okay, so now I'm going to erase all this. So the next author we look at is Jarosław, oh man, Iwaszkiewicz. He lived 1894 to 1980. And he is a very different person. He is a very different author than Gombrowicz. He stayed in Poland his entire life, even during the communist era. Um, his work is very Polish centric. It doesn't attempt to undermine the traditional Polish forms the way Gombrowicz does. He actually he even became a kind of a mid-level Communist Party apparatchik. He was the head of the writers union for several years. So he is essentially Polish. He never really strays from that too much, um, at least on the surface. If you read the chapter from my book where I talk about him, I think he's actually doing a bit of subversion of Polish of some Polish values. But anyway, he so some important one important thing. This is the theme with the two stories that we read from him that I think is really at play here, and it's really at play in a lot of his stories. And that is the tension. Well, maybe not tension, but the link between Eros and Thanatos. Now, what is Eros and Thanatos? You may see Eros and you may recognize Ero, right? So erotic, right? So Eros is the Greek god of love. Um, so love really means life. So Eros and Thanatos is life or love or essentially sex. And Thanatos is the Greek god of death. So love and death, sex and death, love and sex are basically, it's life, right? That's what Eros is. It's all about that. So uh, um, Freud will get a hold of this, and he'll use these ideas and call them the sex drive and the death drive. I'm not going to separate them. Sex drive and death drive. So what Freud sees in these seemingly opposing drives is actually a very close relationship. Um, so what would that mean? Well, there's we can talk about it in several different ways. So, for example, if you just look at the natural world, right? Without things dying, new things couldn't live. So, you just, for example, you go out to a garden. What is it? How do plants grow? They grow off the death of other previous plants, right? Plants die, they disintegrate, they go into the ground, and that fuels new life, right? So there's the connection between sex and death right there, right? Or life and death or whatever. In order for new life to happen, death has to have taken place. Um, and then you get into things like the irony that a person only feels most alive when they are facing death. So why do we bungee jump? Why do we skydive? Why do we drive our car 100 miles an hour down a straightaway or something? Right? It's because there is the threat of death, and that threat of death actually makes us feel more alive. Right? That great irony that in facing death you end up feeling more alive. Right? um, why does life have meaning at all? We are not eternal beings. If we were eternal beings, the meaning we get out of life would there may not even be meaning to life if we were eternal beings. The meaning we as humans, as finite beings, get is from the fact that we know we're going to die at some future date, right? And that understanding of an end time for us gives us some kind of meaning, right? Um, in the medieval era, you get a lot of euphemisms about sex from dying. So, for example, in a lot of romantic songs, when they say to die, uh, they mean to climax. So, at the end of the climax, you fall into a symbolic kind of death, right? There's a calmness, right? So you'll see this in a lot of medieval romantic songs and literature and whatnot. Um, I knew one, and it was like, to kiss, to love, to die, right? But what they meant was climax. Um, and let's so this all gets us to where does this come from? Where does the connection between in our unconsciouses maybe uh, between the connections between sex and death or life and death? Where do these come from? And if you look at myth and religious systems throughout history, um, For example, let's look at Christ. Christ dies so that we can have eternal life, right? Death and life right there. In Hinduism, there's the goddess Kali, and she is both the goddess of death and destruction and the goddess of life. So, in the wake of her destruction, as she moves across existence, new life springs up behind her. Right? So she sweeps away the old, and the new blooms. In some African religions, you get the great snake. So, the idea of the snake bending back on itself, swallowing itself for eternity, right? So within that death, there's from that life is uh, persistent because of the eternal death of it. So the eternal life and the eternal death are connected. In Norse mythology, Odin kills himself several times in order to learn new knowledge. He usually hangs himself. Um, he actually, so I don't know if you've seen the Marvel version of Odin, but he has a patch over his eye. He's lost an eye. Um, and it's never really told why, but Odin is the one-eyed god because he took his own eye out in order to learn. I believe that was so that he could learn the runes, what the mystery of the runes were, like writing. Basically, he was learning writing. To learn that, he had to gouge out one of his eyes. And there are just example upon example upon example in different religious and myth systems. And where does this come from? Um, well, think about your early human on the African steppe, um, and a bolt of lightning comes out of the sky, and it hits the ground and starts a fire. And what you see in front of you is just destruction. This acres upon acres of grass are just burned right from this spark. Nothing's left behind. The animals run off. The grass is all gone, and there's just charred earth left behind. And looking at that, you witness death, right? You witness destruction. But after that happens, within just a couple weeks, new green grass has already started to grow in the place of that dried old dead grass. And it's no longer a burnt wasteland. It's suddenly filled with green and lush life. Well, you witness something like that as an early human, and humans are defined by our imaginations, and it takes very little imagination to to witness something like that and think about and realize the connections that are going on and something mythical to be created out of that. Now this is the example I use because I'm a Kansan, and Kansas is one of the few places in the United States that still does yearly grassland burnings, controlled burns. But in early spring, late winter, maybe once the snow is gone, and all that's left in these huge tracts of grassland, these ancient grasslands, it's all dried grass. There's nothing for animals to eat, and so ranchers will go out and do controlled burns, and it's a beautiful sight if you can witness it, especially at night. There are ribbons of gold fire distant in the horizon, and then during the daylight you can see just this charred earth. But driving along literally in a few days, there's already green shoots of new grass sprouting up. So that death allows for new life to happen. Now, I know that was a long rant, but every semester I rant about this at length for some reason. Why do I bring this up in connection to Iwaszkiewicz? The two stories in particular that we look at, and really much of his oeuvre deals with this connection between Eros and Thanatos, the sex drive and the death drive. So, for example, in A New Love, right? What is A New Love about? It's a very simple story. On the surface, it's about a guy who refuses in the end to let new love happen, right? Because of his fear of it just failing as it has in the past. There's a knock at the door, and within the space of him thinking about, ultimately deciding not to open the door, he talks himself out of allowing this new love to happen. But as that happens, as that internal story in his head about how this relationship is going to go and eventually fail, there are flowers on the table that are dying, right? So as he's going through this life inside his head, this new love life in his head, the flowers that he's put out are dying, right? They're wilting and the petals are all floating to the table. So that's that connection there. In his story, we get to it. Sorry, Sweet Flag. So Sweet Flag is just it's like a water plant. It's a plant that grows up around like ponds and lakes and whatnot. So this link between Eros and Thanatos is very important to this story as well, right? So just in the very opening of the story, so he's talking about, Sweet Flag has two smells. If you rub its long green leaves between your fingers, you release the gentle scent of waters shadowed by willows, right? Waters shadowed by willows. So what is water? Water is life, right? So this, water is shadowed by, so, instantly you think of, you've probably all seen a little, somewhere in walking around a park, you've seen a willow tree, you know, bent over a pond or something, right? But when you tear open a strip of Sweet Flag and put your nose to the seam lined with a kind of woolly fluff, you will sense, along with the musky scent, the smell of marshy loam, of rotting fish scales, of mud. So if you just like caress it in your fingers, you're taken to an idyllic scene of life, right? Of something pleasant. If you tear it open and smell it, rotting fish scales is what comes up. And what is rot? Rot is death, right? But again, rot is the beginning of life again, right? Um, so and then he goes on. Since my earliest days, the smell has been associated with the idea of sudden death. In my childhood, the floors of the entrance hall and the balconies at home were covered with Sweet Flag. During the warm, gay days of Whitsuntide, which is like, I think it's basically just summer solstice. But the weed also reminds me of the death of my first true friend, who bore the odd name of Gratian and who drowned at the age of 13. So this water plant that he's talking about here has a connection in his mind to both life but also death, right? And then what is the story? The story is about a woman kind of older in her life. She's lost her sons to war. She's lost her husband, and she meets a young, vibrant, um, man who, the images she places on him are all about virility and vitality, and he's young in his life, right? He still has so much life to live. And then what happens? They end up being romantic, and the very moment they get romantic, he ends up dying, right? So this he metaphorically, I guess you could say he is the Sweet Flag of the story. Um, Never really thought about those terms, but yeah, in a symbolic way, the boy is the Sweet Flag, right? Um, he he's full of life and then dies in the water, right? Give that some thought. And then the final author we look at in this unit is Bruno Schulz. He lived 1892 to 1942. Um, so he was quite popular in the interwar era. Um, he wrote very, actually he ended up writing very little, compared to his fame in Poland and throughout the world, really. I mean, Penguin has the definitive English edition of Bruno Schulz, and it's still in publication. It is reprinted all the time. Um, and he is a kind of like, if you take a world literature course, it's a good likelihood that he'll pop up in your reading. He was during the interwar era. He was quite popular in the Cafe Society of Warsaw. He and Gombrowicz were very good friends. He was a bit of a player. he I don't know if the kids are still saying that these days, but he was well loved by women in the Warsaw cafe scene, and he got around a bit. He was also an artist, an illustrator. You should definitely Google some of his artwork. It is very weird. The documentary on our Sakai site will talk about this as well. But his art is very strange. He is obsessed with women and women, but in particular women's feet. And if you look at his stuff, he's always in this very subservient position to women. And he's always at their feet, almost like worshiping a goddess. He's the figure of him is almost always like down at ground level, and there's always a woman's foot somewhere. So it's some really far out artwork that he created. Um, his story is very tragic. He When the Nazis invaded Poland, he was in Polish Ukraine in a city called Drohobych. The Nazis took over the city, and it was this kind of weird, psychotic custom for Nazi officers to take on a talented Jew as whatever, as their assistant, or as a basically slave, I guess. And so this one officer took on Schulz, kept him from dying instantly from being sent off to the gas chambers, because he was mildly famous, even in Germany. And this officer knew that he was also an artist, and so he had Schulz paint his child's bedroom in the house in Drohobych. And I'll come to that in a second. So anyway, that Nazi officer ended up killing the Jew of another Nazi officer. And so to make up for it, he let that other Nazi officer kill Schulz. This complete psychopathic behavior. And it's just a tragedy. If like what he could have created if he had lived longer, is just it's unimaginable. His work is just so fantastic. Um, so coming back to his work then, and this will be talked about in the documentary about him. Um, this is yet another tragedy connected to his life. So the artwork he created for this Nazi officer's child was in his room. He painted these fantastic scenes all over the room, and then they were forgotten about. They were covered up for a long time, and in not long ago, I can't remember the exact date, but we're talking like either late 20th or early 21st century. Some plaster fell off of one of those walls, and this was just a common house now. People were just living there, and they saw the artwork, and they did a little digging, realized this was the last artwork of Bruno Schulz. And so Yad Vashem, which is the state agency of Israel, decided that, well, this is their artwork. So they bribed a couple border guards. They went into this house, destroyed part of the wall, and destroyed the artwork, really, and took part of it back to Israel, where Bruno Schulz had never lived. He was a Jew, but he wasn't Israeli. But for some reason, the Israeli authorities thought, oh, well, we should have this. not, hey, let's give the Ukrainian government some money to make sure that this is preserved in the spot that he painted it. I'm still upset about it, but anyway. So anyway, that's the last tragedy of Bruno Schulz's life then. So the stories we look at, can't really say much about them. They're so wild and fantastic. One of the key, I guess, themes is, you know, this is very vague, but what is existence? What is this life we lead? What is but not just the individual life? It's what is how is life created? What is the universal idea of existence? I mean, I don't know how else to put it. Um, so the father, this is not completely autobiographical, although, but it's kind of autobiographic fiction. He uses elements from his actual life to write these stories. He had this very strange relationship with his father, and so his father appears in these stories as this almost maniacal, um, um, strangely spiritual, but also not entity. Um, the father has these ideas about um, how, who decides what exists and what doesn't exist. He's basically he has this struggle with the demiurge. And what is demiurge? Well, demiurge is basically just God. The demiurge is the creator of life. Well, the creator of existence, really. And the father argues that life needs to be rethought. We need to rethink the way existence happens, and the demiurge should not be allowed to be the only creator. He has these strange ideas about beings that can come into existence to fulfill one particular uh, uh, not role, but just action. That we should be able to create, you know, well, bring into existence beings that can perform one function and then they disappear from existence, right? I mean, right. That's a weird idea. There's a lot of if you've read any kind of like popular fiction on like Jewish cabal or Jewish mysticism, that plays a very important role in a lot of his stories. There are a lot of these weird kabbalistic spiritual ideas, mystical ideas that are at play in Schulz's work. Um, so anyway, I'm curious to see what you get out of his stories. Um, it's wide, it's open wide to interpretation. So have fun with it. So that's the end of this lecture. Um, as I said, I'm looking forward to what you have to say about Schulz, but also what you got out of Gombrowicz and Iwaszkiewicz. I've included as optional reading basically the first chapter of my book. Well, I'll show it to you. Okay. Well, that was a mess. So this is my book. Um, I the optional reading and inclusions. I can't believe that just happened. Is actually the first chapter of my dissertation, which was reworked into the first chapter of my book, and it is a comparative analysis of Gombrowicz and Iwaszkiewicz. I think you might find it interesting if you have some extra time to read it. If not, it's fine. But anyway, good luck, and I look forward to reading your ideas.